Brandon had always been a man who valued his independence. He had purchased his house 10 years ago, long before the homeowners association had even existed in his neighborhood. It was a quiet, peaceful place, tucked away from the main road, with a large backyard where he could sip his morning coffee in peace. His home was more than just a building. It was a space that he had built with his own hands, customizing every corner to fit his needs. So when he woke up on a chilly Tuesday morning, groggy from staying up late watching old crime documentaries, the last thing he expected was to find a bright yellow envelope taped aggressively to his front door. At first, he thought it was another flyer for landscaping services or a local pizzeria's discount deal, but as he pulled the paper off the door and read the bold, capitalized letters, his stomach twisted. Notice of Homeowner Association Assessment. His eyebrows furrowed. Homeowner Association Assessment? What homeowner association? He had never signed any agreement to be part of one. As far as he knew, his house was exempt when the homeowner association formed a few years ago. Skimming through the letter, his irritation quickly turned into outright rage. Dear homeowner, as part of our ongoing community improvements, your property has now been officially incorporated into the homeowner association jurisdiction, effective immediately. You are required to adhere to all homeowner association regulations and monthly assessments. Your outstanding balance for backdated community fees totals $4,000. Additionally, moving forward, you are required to pay a monthly community upkeep fee of $2,000. Failure to comply may result in fines, legal action, or property foreclosure. Sincerely, Karen Whitmore, Homeowner Association President. Brandon clenched the paper so hard his knuckles turned white. This had to be some kind of joke. Homeowner association fees? For his own house? A house that had never been under homeowner association control? His first instinct was to throw the letter straight into the trash, but something about it made his blood boil too much to ignore. Brandon grabbed his phone and dialed the number listed at the bottom of the letter. The line rang twice before someone picked up. Homeowner Association office, this is Karen speaking, a smug, familiar voice answered. Of course it was her. Karen Whitmore had been the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood ever since she and her husband moved in 3 years ago. She had immediately taken control of the homeowner association, pushing out anyone who disagreed with her, and began enforcing ridiculous rules, banning basketball hoops, forbidding certain types of flowers, and fining people for things like leaving their trash cans out 5 minutes past pickup. Brandon had never had to deal with her directly before, but he had heard horror stories from his neighbors. Brandon took a deep breath. Karen, what the hell is this notice on my door? There was a pause before Karen responded, her voice oozing with false politeness. Ah, Brandon, I was wondering when you'd call. That's just a standard notice informing you of your new responsibilities as an homeowner association member. My new responsibilities, he repeated, his voice rising. I've never been part of the homeowner association. My house was built before the homeowner association was even created. You can't just force me into it now. Oh, but I can, Karen said sweetly. The homeowner association has decided to expand its jurisdiction to include all homes within the neighborhood boundaries. And, well, your house is within those boundaries, isn't it? Brandon's jaw tightened. You can't just decide that. I never agreed to be part of this. Brandon, Karen said with a condescending chuckle, this is all perfectly legal. You should be thanking me. Being part of the homeowner association means you'll have access to our wonderful community services. Lawn maintenance, security patrols, organized events. I don't need any of those things. Well, you still have to pay for them. Rules are rules. Brandon took a deep breath, trying to control the anger bubbling in his chest. Karen, I'm not paying you a damn cent. My house is mine. You have no right to charge me rent for it. Karen let out a dramatic sigh. Brandon, let's not make this difficult. If you refuse to pay, we will have to take action. Liens, fines, even foreclosure. Brandon nearly crushed his phone in his grip. I'd like to see you try. Suit yourself, she said, her voice dripping with amusement. But don't say I didn't warn you. The call ended. Brandon stood there gripping the letter, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He had expected Karen to be annoying, but this was outright extortion. He stormed back inside and sat down at his desk, pulling up his laptop. If Karen thought she could push him around, she was in for a rude awakening. Time to do some digging. Brandon barely slept that night. The encounter with Karen and her board of lackeys played in his mind like a bad dream, each smug word replaying in his head. He knew this wasn't over. People like Karen didn't back down after a single loss. They escalated, and he wasn't wrong. The next morning, Brandon woke to the sound of metal clanking outside his window. His stomach sank as he pulled back the curtains and looked outside. A group of workers in bright orange vests were hammering a bright red "no parking" sign into his front lawn. His driveway, his own driveway, now had fresh yellow lines painted across the entrance. One of the workers was drilling into the curb, installing what looked like a parking restriction pole. Brandon was out the door before he even had time to put on proper shoes. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" The workers barely looked at him. One of them, a wiry man with sunglasses perched on the bridge of his nose, shrugged. "New homeowner association regulations, sir. No parking allowed in non-designated areas. Orders came from the president herself, Karen." Brandon clenched his fists. "This is my property. You can't do this without my permission." The worker pulled out a clipboard and read from it lazily. "Actually, according to the revised Homeowner Association bylaws, all roads and curbs within the association are considered communal property, and as of last week, that includes this section right here." He gestured broadly toward Brandon's driveway, as if it was some sort of public sidewalk. Brandon felt his blood boil. "I'm not in the damn Homeowner Association." The man shrugged again, clearly indifferent. "Talk to them about it. We just do the work." With that, he went back to drilling, acting as if Brandon wasn't even standing there. Brandon stormed inside and immediately called his lawyer. "They're blocking my driveway, literally painting over my curb. What kind of nonsense is this?" His lawyer sighed. "They're trying to provoke you. If they get you to react emotionally, they can claim you're being aggressive and try to escalate it into something bigger. Don't give them the satisfaction. I'll file a complaint with the city if they altered anything on your property without permission. That's a major violation." Brandon gritted his teeth but nodded to himself. This wasn't just harassment anymore. Karen was actively trying to make his life impossible. By noon, he received an email from the Homeowner Association stating that his unauthorized vehicle had violated parking regulations and that if he continued to break the rules, they would take further action, up to and including towing and fines. Brandon could barely believe what he was reading. His car was parked on his own land, in his own driveway, and these lunatics were trying to control that too? That evening, he returned home to find 2 more violation notices taped to his door. The first was for an unapproved plant species in his yard, his perfectly ordinary rose bushes, which had been there for years. The second was for failure to maintain uniformity in exterior home color, a complete joke since he hadn't repainted anything. He took both notices and tossed them into the garbage. The Homeowner Association was doubling down, trying to wear him out, hoping he'd cave under the pressure. But what Karen didn't understand was that Brandon thrived on spite. The next morning, he woke up to something even worse. His water had been shut off. Brandon turned the faucet in his kitchen. Nothing. He tried the bathroom sink. Dry as a bone. His heart pounded as he ran outside and checked the main shutoff valve near the street. His stomach twisted. The Homeowner Association had placed a heavy metal lock on it. A lock! On his own damn water supply. A fresh violation notice was taped to the valve. Due to unpaid Homeowner Association fees, water service to this property has been temporarily suspended until the balance of $4,000 is cleared. Please remit payment immediately to restore access. Brandon saw red. He marched straight to Karen's house, not even caring that it was barely past 7 a.m. He pounded on the door so hard that the cheap homeowner association-provided wreath fell off its hook. A moment later, Karen opened it, still wearing her silk robe, holding a steaming cup of coffee. She smirked. "Brandon, to what do I owe the pleasure?" "You locked my water." His voice was dangerously low. Karen took a slow sip of her coffee. Yes. Unfortunately, homeowner association policy states that unpaid fees can result in temporary suspension of services. I gave you plenty of warnings, Brandon. You had no right to touch my property. Karen smiled, as if he was a child throwing a tantrum. Actually, the community bylaw revisions allow us to regulate essential services for non-compliant residents. Brandon laughed, but there was no humor in it. Non-compliant? Lady, I was never part of your homeowner association to begin with. Karen's smirk didn't waver. That's your opinion. But the board has already voted. You're in the homeowner association whether you like it or not. And if you refuse to contribute to our shared community, you lose access to shared resources. Brandon could barely believe what he was hearing. You think you're the damn mayor of this town, don't you? Karen sighed, as if she was growing bored. Look, Brandon, just pay the fees. It's not that much money, and this will all go away. Brandon took a step closer, forcing Karen to lean back slightly. Oh, it's going away all right, but not the way you think. He turned on his heel and walked away. He had heard enough. By the time he got home, he already had a plan. His lawyer had told him not to react emotionally, but this was beyond personal now. If Karen thought she could bully him into submission, she was about to learn a very painful lesson. Brandon grabbed his phone and made a call. Yeah, he said, voice tight with anger. I need a plumber, right now, and I need someone to get this lock off my property. I don't care what it takes. Karen had no idea what was coming for her. Brandon didn't waste any time. Within an hour of making the call, a plumber arrived, a burly man with a thick beard and a no-nonsense attitude. He examined the heavy metal lock the homeowner association had placed on Brandon's water valve and let out a low whistle. Man, this is some serious overreach, the plumber muttered, shaking his head. They got no legal right to be messing with a private homeowner's utility like this. Who the hell do they think they are? Brandon crossed his arms, his jaw tight. Karen Whitmore. Self-appointed dictator of this neighborhood, the plumber snorted. Sounds about right. Homeowner association types always think they own the damn world. He reached into his tool bag, pulling out a thick pair of bolt cutters. You sure you want to do this? They're going to lose their minds when they see this thing's gone. Brandon didn't hesitate. Do it. With a sharp clank, the lock snapped off. The plumber tossed it onto the pavement like a piece of trash. He turned the valve and water roared back into Brandon's pipes. There. Now, if they try to pull this stunt again, you call me, or better yet, call the city. They love hearing about homeowner associations acting like little wannabe governments. Brandon handed him cash for the job and thanked him before heading inside. The sound of running water in his kitchen sink had never felt so satisfying. But this wasn't over. Karen would retaliate, he knew that. The only way to end this was to strike first. He spent the rest of the morning gathering evidence. He documented every single violation notice, every fake fine, and every illegal move the homeowner association had made against him. Then, he filed an official complaint with the city housing authority and contacted a real estate attorney to discuss his next legal steps. But Brandon wasn't just relying on the law. No, he had something even better. The homeowner association thrived on control, on making people feel isolated and powerless. But Karen had made one critical mistake. She had pissed off the wrong homeowner. And Brandon wasn't the only one she had screwed over. By the afternoon, he was knocking on his neighbors' doors. One by one, he gathered their stories. Miss Keller, the sweet elderly woman on the corner, had been fined $500 for having a bird feeder in her yard because Karen claimed it was an attraction for pests. A young couple 2 streets over had received a warning about their baby stroller being left outside for more than 10 minutes. Another neighbor, an ex-Marine named Doug, had been forced to remove his American flag because it was too large. The stories kept coming. Karen had built her little kingdom on intimidation, but Brandon was about to burn it down. By the evening, he had organized a full neighborhood meeting. Normally, homeowner association meetings were quiet affairs, with only a handful of homeowners showing up. Karen liked it that way. Fewer people meant less resistance. But this time, Brandon packed the community center. The room buzzed with quiet anger as neighbors filled every chair, whispering to each other. Brandon stood at the front, waiting. Then Karen walked in. She stopped in the doorway, eyes narrowing as she took in the crowd. It was the first time Brandon had seen her off guard. She wasn't used to this. Wasn't used to facing a group that was actually pushing back. But Karen was nothing if not arrogant. She straightened her shoulders and strode to the front, her signature smug smile plastered on her face. "Well," she said, clasping her hands together, "looks like we have quite the turnout today. I'm so glad to see such engaged community members." Brandon didn't wait for her usual nonsense. He slammed a thick stack of documents onto the table. "Cut the crap, Karen. We all know why we're here." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Karen's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly. "Brandon, if this is about your refusal to comply with homeowner association regulations, it's about your blatant abuse of power," Brandon interrupted. "And not just against me, against everyone in this damn room." A few neighbors nodded in agreement. Brandon flipped open the first document. "Miss Keller, fined for a bird feeder, illegal." He flipped another. "Doug, forced to remove his flag, illegal." Another. "The Andersons, fined for their own stroller, illegal." He slapped the papers down, one by one. "And let's not forget you cutting off my damn water, also illegal." Karen's face had gone from confident to pale. She glanced at the homeowner association board members, but none of them met her gaze. They knew what was coming. "Brandon," she said, forcing a laugh, "I think you're misunderstanding the homeowner association's role. We're here to protect property values and—" "You mean extort homeowners," Brandon shot back. "Threaten people, bully them into paying for your little power trip." More neighbors spoke up now, adding their own stories. The room was turning against her. Karen's voice sharpened. "Enough! The homeowner association has every right to enforce—" "No," Brandon said, holding up his final document. "You don't." The room fell silent as Brandon held up the original neighborhood property agreement, the one that stated in clear legal terms that his house and a handful of others were never part of the homeowner association. "You targeted me because you thought I wouldn't fight back," Brandon said, stepping closer. "You lied, you falsified documents, and you broke the law. And guess what, Karen? I'm taking all of this to court." Karen's mouth opened and closed. For the first time, she had no response. Brandon turned to the crowd. "And I suggest anyone else who's been screwed over by her does the same." The tension in the room shifted. Homeowners were no longer whispering. They were talking, agreeing, uniting. Karen had lost control. The board members stayed silent. And then someone in the back spoke. "I motion to vote for Karen's removal as homeowner association president." The room exploded in cheers. Karen's face turned bright red. "You can't do this," she shrieked. "I am the homeowner association." "No, Karen," Brandon said, smiling for the first time that night. "You're finished." She spun toward the board members, looking for support, but they were already distancing themselves. They knew this was over. Karen had pushed too far for too long. Brandon leaned in just enough for her to hear. "You tried to screw me over. Now it's your turn." The meeting ended in chaos. Homeowners celebrating, Karen furious and cornered, the board scrambling to save face. But Brandon knew one thing for certain. Karen had just lost everything, and karma was only getting started. Brandon barely had time to enjoy the sight of Karen storming out of the homeowner association meeting before the fallout truly began. He had expected her to retreat, lick her wounds, maybe even attempt some last-minute maneuver to save herself. But what he hadn't expected was just how fast the board would turn against her. The next morning, an email went out to all homeowners announcing an emergency homeowner association board restructuring. It was a desperate move, a flimsy attempt to pretend they had everything under control when, in reality, the entire organization was crumbling from the inside. Brandon smirked as he read it over his morning coffee. The board members were trying to wash their hands of her, and they were doing it in the most cowardly way possible, by pretending that she had acted alone, that they had no idea what she had been doing, that they were just as much victims as everyone else. He knew better. The board had backed Karen at every turn, allowed her to bully homeowners, stood by while she issued fines for the most ridiculous reasons, and only now, when their own positions were at risk, did they suddenly find their spines. But Brandon wasn't interested in their fake attempts at redemption. He had bigger things to focus on. The lawsuit against Karen was moving forward. His lawyer had been almost giddy when Brandon forwarded him the foreclosure notice she had personally signed. "This is a gift," he had said over the phone. "She didn't just screw up, she broke the law. We're talking fraud, harassment, and unlawful foreclosure threats. She's looking at massive fines and possibly even criminal charges if we push hard enough." Brandon had no doubt the board was aware of this too, which explained why they were scrambling to distance themselves. Karen, however, wasn't taking her downfall quietly. That much became obvious when Brandon stepped outside later that day and found his entire front yard covered in trash. Bags of garbage had been dumped across his lawn, some torn open so that rotting food and crumpled newspapers spilled onto the grass. Someone had even gone the extra mile to smear what looked like paint or motor oil across his driveway. Brandon exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. It wasn't hard to guess who was responsible. Karen was lashing out, doing whatever petty, last-ditch nonsense she could think of to make his life miserable. But this was just pathetic. He didn't even bother calling the police. He had security cameras, and that was all he needed. A quick check of the footage showed exactly what he expected. Karen, in the dead of night, dumping bags of garbage onto his lawn with all the grace of a drunken raccoon. He actually laughed as he watched it, shaking his head. She wasn't even trying to be subtle. Maybe she thought she could get away with it, that he wouldn't have proof. Or maybe she just didn't care anymore. Either way, it didn't matter. He clipped the footage, saved it, and sent it straight to his lawyer with a simple message: add vandalism to the list. But Brandon wasn't just going to let her get away with this. No, he had been on the defensive long enough. It was time to finish this. He made a few calls, starting with the city's housing authority to inform them about the homeowner association's fraudulent foreclosure threats. Then he contacted the local news station. The story had already gained some traction. Homeowner association president accused of fraud and harassment had a nice ring to it, but this latest stunt, this was the kind of thing that made headlines. By the next morning, a news van was parked right outside Karen's house. Brandon watched from his porch as a reporter knocked on her door. Karen answered, her face immediately twisting into a scowl when she saw the microphone. Brandon couldn't hear what was being said, but he didn't need to. The way she started waving her hands angrily, her face getting redder by the second, the way she slammed the door and then immediately peeked through the curtains like a cornered animal, it was clear that she was losing whatever fragile grip she still had on her crumbling empire. And then, the final blow came. That afternoon, Brandon received a call from his lawyer. "You're gonna love this," he said, barely able to contain his amusement. The homeowner association just sent a statement announcing Karen's official removal as president. The board threw her under the bus completely. They're cutting all ties, voiding a bunch of her fines, and publicly stating that they had no prior knowledge of her actions. Brandon smirked. "Wow, real loyal bunch." "Oh, it gets better," his lawyer continued. "Karen's legal troubles? They're piling up fast. The housing authority is investigating her for illegal foreclosure threats. We've got a strong civil case against her for harassment and fraud, and the footage of her vandalizing your yard, that's a criminal charge." Brandon exhaled, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. "So what happens now?" "Now," his lawyer chuckled, "now Karen gets exactly what she deserves." And she did. Within weeks, Karen had lost everything. The civil case went through smoothly. Brandon didn't even have to appear in court. The evidence was overwhelming, and the judge ruled in his favor without hesitation. Karen was ordered to pay thousands in damages, but the real hit came when the criminal charges for vandalism and harassment stuck. The fines alone were brutal, but combined with her legal fees and the homeowner association board refusing to support her, she was completely bankrupt. Her house, the same overpriced McMansion she had lorded over the neighborhood, went into foreclosure. The irony wasn't lost on Brandon. The woman who had spent years threatening others with fines, foreclosures, and power trips was now the one being kicked out of her own home. The day the eviction notice was posted on her door, Brandon took a casual walk past her house, just in time to see her standing on the porch, staring at the bright orange paper with a look of pure disbelief. She turned, caught sight of him, and for a moment there was nothing but raw, helpless fury in her eyes. Brandon smiled, raised his coffee cup, took a slow sip. Karen snapped. She screamed something at him. He couldn't hear it over the sound of a moving truck pulling up in front of her house, but the rage in her expression was almost comical. She had built her entire life around controlling others, around bending people to her will, and now she had nothing. Brandon didn't stick around to watch the rest. He had already won. Later that evening, as he sat on his porch, a few neighbors stopped by to chat. The mood was lighter, freer, like a storm had finally passed. They laughed, swapped stories about Karen's worst moments, and for the first time in a long time, the neighborhood felt like home again. Brandon exhaled, leaning back in his chair, feeling satisfied in a way he hadn't in months. Karen was gone. The homeowner association was under new, reasonable management, and best of all, his house was his again. No more fines, no more threats, no more power-hungry dictators in the form of suburban middle-aged women with a god complex. It was finally over. And damn, it felt good. Brandon sat on his porch, watching as the last of Karen's belongings were loaded into the back of a rusted old moving van. The expensive furniture, the designer decor, the ridiculous ornamental garden statues she had once fined people for not having. All of it was packed away, ready to be hauled off to wherever people like Karen went after they lost everything. A part of him had expected her to fight to the bitter end, to go out screaming, threatening lawsuits, making promises of revenge. But Karen wasn't yelling anymore. She wasn't cursing his name. She wasn't even looking at anyone. She stood by the van, her once pristine appearance now a pale shadow of itself. Her perfectly manicured nails were chipped. Her hair, usually styled to an exhausting degree, was thrown into a messy bun, and her clothes were plain and practical. There were no more expensive sunglasses perched on her head, no more gaudy jewelry weighing down her fingers. She just looked defeated. The neighborhood had gathered to watch, though they pretended otherwise. A few people were walking their dogs, some were checking their mail, and others simply stood outside casually chatting while stealing glances at the woman who had tormented them for years. No one offered her help. No one wished her well. Brandon took a slow sip of his coffee, letting the satisfaction settle deep into his bones. He didn't hate Karen, not really. He just didn't care about her anymore. That was the best revenge of all, watching her fade into irrelevance. She had built her entire identity around controlling people, about making their lives miserable just so she could feel powerful. Now, she had no power, no house, no authority, nothing. As the last box was thrown into the truck, Karen finally turned toward Brandon. Her eyes flickered over him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, she almost looked like she was going to say something. Maybe one last insult, maybe a desperate plea, maybe an admission of guilt, though Brandon doubted she was capable of that. But in the end, she did nothing. She simply climbed into the passenger seat, slammed the door, and the truck rumbled to life. The sound of its old engine rattled down the street as it pulled away, growing smaller and smaller until it was gone. And just like that, Karen was out of their lives. Brandon let out a long, slow breath, stretching out in his chair. "So," a voice said beside him. He turned to see Doug, the ex-Marine neighbor who had been forced to take down his flag. He was standing by Brandon's porch, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at his lips. "You gonna miss her?" Brandon snorted. "Yeah, like I'd miss food poisoning." Doug chuckled, stepping up onto the porch and sitting down in the chair beside him. "Gotta say, didn't think anyone could take her down. We all wanted to, but you actually did it." "Didn't do it alone," Brandon admitted. "You all helped." "Maybe," Doug said, scratching his beard. "But you started it. You didn't let her push you around, and you didn't stop when she doubled down. That's what made the difference." Brandon shrugged, but he couldn't deny there was some truth to that. A lot of people had been willing to fight Karen, but not many were willing to outlast her. That was her real power. She wore people down, exhausted them with fines, threats, and bureaucracy until they just gave up. But Brandon, he had been too damn stubborn to quit. More neighbors began to gather. Miss Keller, the elderly woman Karen had fined for her bird feeder, brought over a tray of fresh-baked cookies. The young couple from 2 streets over, the ones who had been written up for leaving their baby stroller outside for too long, came over with their little girl. Conversation sparked, laughter bubbled up, and the air felt lighter than it had in years. The homeowner association still existed, technically, but after Karen was thrown out, the remaining board members had completely overhauled the rules. The ridiculous fines, the arbitrary punishments, the unnecessary restrictions, gone. In fact, the entire homeowner association structure had changed. There were no longer unchecked fines or power-hungry presidents. Everything was voted on as a community, fairly, with actual transparency. Homeowners had a say again, instead of living under the thumb of a dictator. It was a victory, but more than that, it was justice. Brandon glanced around at the people gathered on his lawn, talking, laughing, actually enjoying their neighborhood again. It wasn't just about getting rid of Karen, it was about reclaiming their home. And they had done it. As the sun began to set, Brandon leaned back in his chair, the last remnants of his coffee long gone, but the satisfaction still lingering. The battle was over, the war had been won. Karen was gone, and she wasn't coming back. For the first time in a long time, Brandon felt truly at peace.